On our desert island this week is the guitarist and lutenist Julian Bream. Julian, how well could you endure solitude, all alone on this wretched island?
Well, I probably could endure it rather more than a lot of people because, well, in my profession I'm nearly always playing on my own and travelling on my own. And for the last nearly 20 years I've lived right out in the country, away from what would seem ordinary civilization, and I rather enjoy that. I don't think I would enjoy the desert island for too long.
Do you think a few discs would help?
I think a good few discs would certainly help.
Well, just 8. Do you play discs a lot at home?
Not a great deal, no. Well, I think one of the reasons is that my low-fi, as opposed to hi-fi, it doesn't sound very well. So I'm rather loath to play records, and they sound awfully scratchy.
Did you have any plan in choosing this meagre allowance of just 8 discs?
Well, I found it very, very hard to do. For example, a composer like Mozart, who I probably adore more than any other, I could have chosen at least 20, 25 pieces. But I've chosen one piece which actually had a tremendous impact on me because it was almost the very first piece of Mozart I ever heard. And it was the old recording made by the Pro Arte quartet of the G minor quintet.
Yes.
And this is a piece which it was sort of really love at first sight, and I think I adore this piece of Mozart more than perhaps anything.
Do you remember the actual occasion when you heard it for the first time?
Yes, I do. I was on the radio. It must have been 1945, 46. And I was completely entranced, as I am today.
The opening of the Mozart Quintet in G minor, a vintage recording by the Pro Arte Quartet plus Alfred Hobday. You are a Londoner, aren't you, Julian?
Very much so, yes.
Any music in the family?
My father was a good amateur pianist, but he couldn't really read music on the piano. He played marvellously well by ear.
Yes.
He then took up the guitar in the war, and he learned a little bit of music, but he played quite well on the plectrum guitar. He played jazz, in fact.
He played in a dance band for a while,
yes,
didn't he?
In fact, he had his own little group. And it was through his influence, and particularly the music that he played, which was the popular tunes of the period, that I really became interested in music.
Did he put you to the guitar, or did you take his guitar and start to play it?
Well, I think actually I took his guitar because, you see, he worked in the daytime, and sometimes when I wasn't at school, the guitar was always laying around. It was either propped up in a corner or off lying on a chair. And I used to play with this guitar, while he was away, of course,
Yes.
and play with the radio. I used to have the radio blaring on, you know, the sort of workers' playtime or whatever it was. And I used to love doing that and just strumming the instrument. And one day my father came home early from work and caught me playing his guitar, and I thought he was going to be absolutely furious. I thought he was going to hit the roof. Instead, he smiled and he said, well, you know, if you are keen about it, I'll start you off.
So he gave you some lessons?
Yes.
There was an eventful day when Dad brought home a Segovia disc.
There was indeed. In fact, it was hearing this disc that really got me started onto the classical guitar, because up to then I was playing, or trying to play, jazz and popular music. But my father did bring home this record, and then for my 11th birthday he brought home a little Spanish guitar.
Of your very own?
For me, yes.
Yes.
It was a most lovely little instrument, and so he started me on that too.
Did you ever see Segovia?
Not at that time. In fact, there was, in 1944, a rumour that he died in South America. But he came to England in 1947, and that's when I heard him first. And, of course, it was simply, electrifying, simply an incredible experience.
You borrowed a pair of binoculars, I believe, to take to the Wigmore Hall.
Yes. Well, you see, it was very difficult in those days to get any really authentic lessons on the guitar. And so I thought the best thing was to go to Segovia's recital with a pair of binoculars so that I could see the sort of intimate workings of his fingers. And actually that worked pretty well, though I used to get, my arm used to ache rather, because they were very good binoculars, but very heavy.
Jumping ahead, you did in fact have a few lessons with him.
Well, I did. I had one in 1947 and one in 1948. But as valuable as these lessons were, I learnt more, in fact, from just watching him play at concerts.
But you were firmly resolved at this time that you were going to be a professional guitarist.
Firmly. I mean, the actual chances of becoming one were very remote.
Mm-hmm.
But it was something which I loved, and I couldn't visualise a life that was without the guitar, really.
But you were learning music in general. You were also learning the piano.
I was learning the piano, and I was at the Royal College of Music and learning the cello.
Now, incredible as it may seem nowadays, I believe at that time the Royal College of Music did not have a course for teaching the guitar.
No, they didn't, and not for many years. In fact, there really wasn't a good teacher in the whole country for many years.
It wasn't a respectable instrument.
No, it wasn't. I mean, people respected Segovia naturally, but they thought he was very much a one-off freak, I suppose, which he was. I mean, nobody played like him. I mean, it was simply fantastic.
Do you remember your very first professional engagement, where you were paid any kind of fee at all for performing in public?
Well, my first job, in which I got 2 guineas, was for playing at a private function in London, at the home of Prince and Princess Galitzine. And I remember this very well because I'd lived in the suburbs of London at Hampton-on-Thames, and it was the first time I'd ever been up to a big West End party.
How old were you?
I was about 12 or something like that, 13 perhaps. And the effect of this party was incredible. And I was just employed or asked to play 4 or 5 tunes, which I did. And I remember this very well because there was a lot of food. And, you know, in the war we had such little rations that it was absolutely incredible to see all these chickens and plates of beef and so forth. So, in fact, I ate a great deal after playing and was promptly very ill.
Oh, dear.
It was rather sad, but I got my 2 guineas, and I thought with 2 guineas I owned the world.
Of course. Well, we've got you launched. Let's have your second record.
Well, my second record is a guitarist, but one who had quite an influence on my playing, although he is not a classical player. He is the great French gypsy guitarist Django Reinhardt. And my father collected all his old 78s, and so his music was the very first music that I heard. And there was a lot worse music that I could have heard, because Django, at his best, I think, is a phenomenal musician. It just so happens that there's one lovely record of Django not only playing the guitar, but also playing the violin, which I think is a very unique record.
Yes, I had no idea he could play the violin.
Well, nor did I. But apparently before, you know, he had this terrible accident with his left hand.
Yes.
And the 3rd and 4th fingers were paralysed. He could hardly use those. Well, apparently he did actually play the violin before the accident. But he gave up the violin, and then somebody lent him a violin for this recording.
A rare record recorded in 1942 of Django Reinhardt playing the guitar and the violin. Now, you told us about your first professional engagement under very glamorous circumstances. In fact, the following year you gave your first recital.
Yes, that's right, in Cheltenham.
This was pretty ambitious. You could only have been, 14?
About that, yes, I suppose. And also the programme was pretty hard that I chose. I remember being very, very nervous. And for some strange reason, I had to borrow a guitar for that particular concert, and I only had a chance to get used to that instrument, about 3 or 4 hours before. So that really was quite a hair-raising concert.
To say the least, it was a challenge.
It was, but it went pretty well.
And you began to work on the radio?
Very much. In fact, I actually, the year before, appeared on the television, just as it started up in the Alexandra Palace days.
Yes.
And I played on
What was
that.
the show?
It was, I think, the very first show of Music for You. Was that the programme with Eric Robinson?
Oh, yes.
And then I'd done a programme that was sent out to Spain, especially Bream for the overseas service. And then I started by about 47 doing the odd, not so much recital, but working mostly on the light programme, playing music between the light music units, orchestral concerts.
And as soon as you left the Royal College, you were called up for your national service?
Yes, that was some time later, when I was about 18.
Yes.
Yes, I went straight from the college, where I had a most marvellous time. Really, I loved my college days. Straight into the army, which were the most hideous and awful days of my life. In fact, I went just to the extremes in about 2 weeks.
But you did get some music making while you were in uniform?
Oh, yes, I did. Not initially. I was actually put into the pay corps, and I had to do sort of infantry training for a couple of months. But then eventually I managed to get out of that. I had one or two friends who had a little bit of influence. And that works magic in the army, you know.
Indeed.
You've got to have a bit of influence. And luckily I was pulled out of the pay corps and put into the Royal Artillery Band.
Yes.
And of course it was a bit difficult to really get into that because you can't play the guitar on the march quite.
What were you playing?
Well, in fact, I did all sorts of odd jobs in the Royal Artillery Band. But I did occasionally play the cello in the mess orchestra. I then occasionally, quite often, played the jazz guitar. I took up jazz again, and I took up the electric guitar, no less. And I rather enjoyed that, I must say. I mean, I just didn't like the being on parade every morning. But eventually I managed to live out. I managed to work it that I could live in a flat in London, in the West End. And then I had a little van, and I used to drive down to Woolwich every morning for the parade. And I mean, eventually I found a very, as they say in the army, cushy number.
I see. According to my figures, you were in the army for about 3.5 years. Well, you were only supposed to be in about 18 months, weren't you?
Well, 2 years. But you see, in order to get into the army band, I had to sign on for 21 years.
Oh, no,
Yeah.
you should still be there.
Yeah, no, 20, well, not quite actually, Roy, but it was a frightening thing to sign a piece of paper which says 21 years with the colours, but with the option of getting out every 3.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't
yes.
waste a day. So I did 6 months in the pay corps, and then I had to do 3 years as a regular soldier.
That accounts for your military bearing.
That's it.
Let's have your third record.
Well, now, as I mentioned, I became interested in jazz again. I was about 18 or 19. One of the groups that I loved, and I thought was, in its way, you know, just as remarkable as the Pro Arty Quartet, but in jazz, was the Benny Goodman Quintet. And they were recording in the mid-40s. And not only Goodman, but I think his personnel were absolutely terrific. I mean, for example, Teddy Wilson, I thought, was the most wonderful pianist, and Slam Stewart on the bass, and there's Murray Fell drums, and I think Red Norvo is as good, for my money, as Lionel Hampton, as you will hear. And this is After You've Gone, played by the Benny Goodman Quintet.